The scent of jasmine and decay hung heavy in the evening air as Elara made her way through the abandoned gardens behind the monastery. She had come here seeking solitude, needing to process the weight of everything that had transpired in recent days. The ancient stone pathways were cracked and overgrown, weeds pushing through gaps where once pristine flowers had bloomed. It seemed fitting somehow that she would find herself drawn to places where beauty and ruin coexisted. She paused beside a fountain that had long since run dry, its marble cherubs stained with moss and bird droppings. The irony was not lost on her. Even the most innocent of creatures, carved in stone, could not escape the passage of time and the inevitability of corruption. Her fingers traced the edge of the basin, feeling the rough texture of neglect beneath her palm. "Lost in thought, little dove?" The voice came from behind her, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. Elara spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs as she searched the shadows between the overgrown hedges. Nothing moved except the gentle sway of branches in the night breeze. "Who's there?" she called, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear crawling up her spine like ice water. A low chuckle echoed from somewhere to her left, then her right, then behind her again. The sound seemed to bounce off the crumbling walls, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. "Someone who has been watching you for quite some time, I'm afraid. Someone who finds your little rebellion, against fate rather, amusing." Before she could react, before she could even think to run, shadows erupted from the ground around her feet like black flames. They wrapped around her ankles, her wrists, her throat, not quite solid but undeniably real. The touch was cold enough to burn, and she gasped as they began to constrict. "Don't struggle," the voice advised, closer now, almost conversational. "Shadow bonds only tighten when you fight them. Rather like quicksand, really, though considerably more elegant." 3 figures emerged from the darkness between the ancient trees, moving with the fluid grace of predators who had never known what it meant to be prey. They were tall and lean, dressed in clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their faces were pale as moonlight, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that glowed like embers in the gloom. The one in the center stepped forward, and Elara could see that he was different from the others. Where they moved with the mechanical precision of soldiers, he carried himself with the lazy confidence of someone who had never met an obstacle he couldn't overcome. His hair was dark as midnight, falling in waves to his shoulders, and when he smiled, she caught a glimpse of teeth that were perhaps a shade too sharp. "Elara Nightshade," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like a caress. "Though I suppose that's not your real name, is it? No matter. Names are just costumes we wear to make others more comfortable with who we pretend to be." "Let me go," she said, trying to inject authority into her voice even as the shadow bonds continued to hold her fast. "I don't know what you want, but you'll give us nothing. Fight us to your last breath. Die before you betray those you love." His laugh was rich and dark, like expensive wine aged in cellars where no light had ever fallen. "How refreshingly predictable. Do you know how many brave souls have spoken those exact words to me over the years? How many have sworn they would never break, never bend, never bow?" He took another step closer, close enough that she could smell something on him, sandalwood and steel, with an undertone of something that might have been blood. "They all break eventually, little dove. Some sooner than others, but they all break. The only question is what pieces of themselves they'll sacrifice to make the pain stop." "You're wrong," Elara said, meeting his gaze despite every instinct screaming at her to look away. "Some people can't be broken." "Everyone can be broken," he replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The trick is finding the right pressure point. For some, it's physical pain. For others, it's watching those they care about suffer. For a precious few, his fingers ghosted along her cheek, never quite touching but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. For a precious few, it's the slow realization that everything they thought they knew about themselves was a lie. The shadows began to move, lifting her off the ground as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She found herself floating several feet above the cracked stone pathway, suspended in a web of darkness that pulsed with its own alien life. "Who are you?" she demanded, proud that her voice still held defiance even as terror clawed at her throat. "How rude of me not to introduce myself properly," he said with a mock bow that was somehow more insulting than outright hostility. "I am Lucian Ashworth, senior operative of Her Majesty's personal guard and occasional artist in the medium of human suffering. These are my associates, though I wouldn't waste time learning their names. They're about as interesting as they are dispensable." The two other figures flanked him like living shadows, their faces expressionless as carved stone. Everything about them screamed trained killer, from the way they held themselves to the casual ease with which they wore their weapons. "The Night Court," Elara breathed, recognition dawning like a cold sunrise. "Very good," Lucian purred. "I do so love working with intelligent prey. It makes the dance so much more stimulating." He gestured, and the shadows began to carry her forward, through the ruined gardens, and toward a path that led deeper into the wilderness beyond. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, though she wasn't entirely certain she wanted to know the answer. "To meet someone who has been very eager to make your acquaintance," Lucian replied. "Our queen has heard whispers about the little mortal girl who thinks she can change the world. She finds the concept quaint." They moved through the forest with supernatural speed, the shadows carrying Elara along, as if she were nothing more than a leaf caught in a hurricane. Trees blurred past in streaks of black and gray, and the normal sounds of the night owls calling, small animals rustling through underbrush, faded until there was nothing but the whisper of wind and the soft footfalls of her captors. "Tell me something, little dove," Lucian said as they traveled, his voice carrying easily despite the speed of their movement. "What do you think makes a person truly good?" It was such an unexpected question that Elara found herself considering it seriously despite their circumstances. I even when there's How wonderfully naive, he replied, though there was something in his tone that suggested he might not entirely disagree. "And what about someone who does terrible things for good reasons? Are they good or evil?" "I don't know," she admitted. I think most people aren't entirely one or the other. We all have the capacity for both light and darkness." "Ah, now that's interesting." Lucian's pace slowed slightly, and she could feel his attention focus on her like a physical weight. Most people want to believe in absolute moral truths. Good versus evil, right versus wrong, heroes versus villains. It's so much simpler that way, isn't it? So much easier to decide which side deserves to win. But you don't believe that? I believe that the world is painted in shades of gray, and anyone who claims to see it in black and white is either lying or blind. His voice carried a note of something that might have been bitterness. I have done things that would make your blood run cold. Little dove, I have killed innocents and tortured the righteous and served a queen whose very existence is an affront to everything most people hold sacred. But I have also saved lives, protected the weak, and chosen mercy when justice would have been easier." "Then why do you serve her?" Elara asked, genuinely curious despite the danger of her situation. Lucian was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, almost vulnerable. "Because someone has to. Because the alternative is chaos, and chaos devours everything good and evil alike. Because sometimes the only way to protect the light is to stand guard in the darkness." They had been traveling for what felt like hours when the forest began to change around them. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches forming a canopy so thick that no starlight could penetrate. Strange flowers bloomed in impossible colors, deep purples that seemed to glow from within, blues so dark they were almost black, reds that pulsed like beating hearts. "Welcome to the Shadowlands," Lucian announced. "I do hope you're not allergic to magic. The concentration here tends to be rather intense." Elara could feel it the moment they crossed some invisible threshold. The air itself seemed to thrum with power, making her skin tingle and her teeth ache. It was like standing too close to a lightning storm, all potential energy and barely contained violence. "How is this possible?" she whispered, staring at a vine that seemed to be made of crystallized moonlight. "The night court exists in the spaces between worlds," Lucian explained. "Places where reality is more flexible, where thought and will can reshape matter, where dreams and nightmares take physical form. It's quite beautiful, really, once you adjust to the constant possibility of having your soul torn from your body." The path ahead of them opened into a vast clearing, and Elara's breath caught in her throat at what she saw there. A palace rose from the forest floor like something from a fever dream, its spires twisting toward the hidden sky in impossible spirals. The walls seemed to be carved from black glass, reflecting distorted images of anyone who looked too closely. Lights flickered in windows that appeared and disappeared as she watched, and the main entrance was guarded by creatures that were definitely not human. "Impressive, isn't it?" Lucian said, following her gaze. "It took 3 centuries to build and has been expanded 17 times since then. The architect went mad during the initial construction, though whether that was from the technical challenges or the client's demands is still a matter of some debate." The shadows carrying Elara began to descend, lowering her toward the ground as they approached the palace gates. The creatures standing guard turned their attention toward the approaching group, and she could see that they had once been human, or at least humanoid. Now they were something else entirely, their bodies twisted into new configurations that somehow remained functional despite defying every law of anatomy she knew. "The Queen's personal guard," Lucian noted, observing her horrified fascination. "Volunteers, every one of them. Amazing what people will agree to when offered the right incentives." "What kind of incentives?" Elara asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know. "Immortality, for the most part. Enhanced strength, supernatural senses, immunity to most forms of conventional harm." He paused, studying her expression. "Of course, there are certain side effects. But then there always are, aren't there? Nothing worthwhile ever comes without a price." The gates opened at their approach, massive panels of the same black glass as the walls, decorated with scenes that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of one's eye. Beyond lay a courtyard paved with stones that gleamed like polished obsidian, surrounded by gardens where flowers bloomed in defiance of all natural law. "Tell me, little dove," Lucien said as they crossed the threshold into the palace proper. "What do you know about the Fey courts?" "Only what everyone knows," Elara replied carefully. "That they exist parallel to our world, that they're ruled by beings of immense power, that mortals who wander into their territories rarely return unchanged." "All true, as far as it goes," he agreed. "But incomplete. The courts are not just ruled by powerful beings. They are manifestations of those beings' will. The summer court reflects its queen's passion and creativity, all golden light and endless growth. The winter court embodies its king's cold logic and perfect order, beautiful as carved ice and twice as unforgiving. They passed through corridors lined with tapestries that depicted scenes of impossible beauty and terrible violence, often within the same frame. Servants moved through the halls with the fluid grace of dancers, though their faces were hidden behind masks of silver and bone. "And the night court?" Elara prompted when Lucien fell silent. "The night court is dreams and nightmares given form," he said. "It is the place where hidden desires become reality, where secret fears take shape and walk among us. It is ruled by a queen who understands that darkness is not the absence of light. It is something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous." They climbed a staircase that seemed to spiral upward forever, past windows that showed views of landscapes that could not possibly exist. Elara saw cities of crystal suspended in starless voids, oceans of liquid silver beneath aurora skies, forests where the trees grew downward from floating islands. Each vista was more impossible than the last, yet she could not shake the feeling that they were not illusions but glimpses of real places that existed somewhere beyond her understanding. "Are you afraid?" Lucien asked as they climbed, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space of the stairwell. Elara considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her emotional state. Fear was there, certainly a cold knot in her stomach that had been growing since the moment she'd first heard his voice in the garden. But there was something else as well, something she was reluctant to acknowledge even to herself. "Yes," she said finally, "but not only afraid." "Oh?" His tone sharpened with interest. "What else?" "Curious," she admitted. "This is all so far beyond anything I've ever experienced. Terrifying, yes, but also fascinating. Like being allowed to see behind the curtain of reality itself." Lucien's laughter this time was different, warmer, more genuine. "Now that is refreshing. Most mortals who find themselves in your position are so consumed with terror that they miss the wonder of it all. The night court is many things dangerous, seductive, utterly ruthless when necessary, but it is never boring." They reached a landing where the staircase ended at a pair of doors that seemed to be carved from a single enormous pearl. The surface was smooth as glass, but warm to the touch, and patterns of light moved within it, like schools of luminescent fish swimming through dark water. "Beyond these doors," Lucien said, his voice taking on a formal cadence, "lies the throne room of Her Majesty, Queen of the Night Court, Sovereign of Shadows, Mistress of Dreams and Nightmares. You will show proper respect, answer when spoken to, and remember that your life hangs by a thread so gossamer thin that a harsh word could sever it. And if I refuse, then you will still enter, but as a corpse rather than a guest. The Queen will have her audience with you one way or another, little dove. The only question is whether you'll be conscious to enjoy it." Elara straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Then let's get this over with." The doors opened at Lucien's gesture, swinging inward on hinges that made no sound. Beyond lay a chamber so vast that its far walls were lost in misty darkness. The ceiling stretched up into infinity, or perhaps there was no ceiling at all, only a star field that seemed to writhe and pulse with its own alien life. The throne itself was a work of art that defied description. It appeared to be carved from a single block of midnight blue stone, but the surface rippled like water and occasionally showed glimpses of things moving within its depths. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, clearly designed to inspire both awe and terror in anyone who looked upon it. But it was the figure seated upon that throne who truly commanded attention. The Queen of the Night Court was not what Elara had expected. She had imagined some terrible crone or seductive succubus, a creature of obvious evil and unmistakable malice. Instead, she found herself looking at someone who might have been beautiful, if not for the absolute wrongness that clung to her like a second skin. She appeared to be a woman in her early 30s, with pale skin and hair so dark it seemed to absorb light. Her features were delicate, almost fragile, and her dress was the deep blue black of midnight sky. But her eyes were ancient as mountains and cold as the space between stars. They held the weight of eons and the promise of eternities yet to come. "Approach," the Queen said, her voice carrying easily across the impossible distance of the throne room. It was a pleasant voice, melodious and cultured, which somehow made it more unsettling than any monstrous roar would have been. Elara felt the shadow bonds release her, dropping her gently to the polished floor. Her legs were unsteady after the long captivity, but she managed to remain upright as she walked toward the throne. Each step echoed in the vast space, and she was acutely aware of the dozens of courtiers who lined the walls. Pale, beautiful creatures who watched her progress with the idle interest of predators evaluating potential craw. "Pray, Elara Thorne," the Queen said when she had approached to within a few yards of the throne. "Though you have worn many names in your short life, haven't you? Refugee, orphan, student, rebel. Tell me, child, which of these do you consider your truest self?" "I don't know," Elara replied honestly. "I'm still figuring that out." "How wonderfully honest," the Queen purred. "So many mortals come before me spouting elaborate lies about their noble purposes and pure intentions. It's refreshing to meet one who admits to uncertainty." She rose from her throne with fluid grace, descending the steps with the measured pace of someone who had never been in a hurry and never would be. Up close, Elara could see that her apparent humanity was an illusion. Her skin had a subtle luminescence, like moonlight on water, and her movements were just slightly too perfect, too controlled. "Do you know why you're here?" the Queen asked, circling Elara like a shark studying its prey. "Because I've been causing problems for you," Elara gasped. "Because I'm part of something that threatens your power." "Power?" The Queen's laughter was like crystal wind chimes in a hurricane. "Child, I have ruled this realm for 5,000 years. I have seen empires rise and fall, watched species evolve and go extinct, observed the birth and death of stars. What could a mortal child possibly do to threaten my power? Then why am I here?" The Queen stopped directly in front of her, so close that Elara could smell her perfume, something that brought to mind midnight gardens and forbidden fruit. "Because you interest me. Because in all my centuries of existence, I have rarely encountered someone who burned so brightly with unrealized potential." She reached out and touched Elara's cheek with fingers that were warm as summer stones. "You stand at a crossroads, child. Down one path lies the life you've always known. Simple safe, inconsequential. Down the other lies power beyond your wildest dreams, the ability to reshape reality according to your will, to become something more than merely human. At what cost? Elara asked, though she already suspected the answer. Everything you were, the queen replied without hesitation. Your mortality, your limitations, your naive certainties about right and wrong. In exchange, you would gain eternity, strength, and the wisdom that comes from seeing the world as it truly is, rather than as you wish it were. And if I refuse, then you return to your little war, fight your hopeless battles, and die forgotten in some muddy field while better men claim credit for your sacrifice. The queen's voice remained pleasant, conversational, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the destruction of everything Elara held dear. Your friends will mourn you briefly, then move on with their lives. Your enemies will not remember your name. Within a generation, it will be as if you never existed at all. That's not true, Elara said, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. Isn't it? The queen gestured, and the air shimmered around them. Suddenly they were standing in what appeared to be a library, its shelves stretching up beyond sight and filled with more books than could possibly exist in the entire world. This is the archive of all things, where every story that has ever been or ever will be is recorded. Would you like to see what your future holds if you continue on your current path? Without waiting for an answer, she pulled a leather-bound volume from a nearby shelf and opened it to a page near the end. The text was written in a script that seemed to shift and change even as Elara watched, but somehow she could still read it clearly. The words painted a picture of failure and loss. She saw herself falling in the final battle, struck down by an enemy whose face she never saw clearly. She saw Kaelin weeping over Ka, her broken body, saw their cause collapse without her to unite the disparate factions, saw their enemies triumphant and their friends scattered to the winds. This is a lie, she whispered, but even as she spoke the words she could feel their hollowness. The future is never certain, the queen admitted, closing the book with a soft thud, but this is the most likely outcome. You are one mortal girl, fighting against forces that have shaped the world for millennia. What makes you think you can succeed where countless others have failed? The library faded around them, replaced by the vast throne room once more. Elara found herself back at the foot of the throne, though she had no memory of moving. The queen settled gracefully onto her seat of power, studying her guest with those ancient, terrible eyes. I am offering you a chance to truly make a difference, she continued. Join me, and you'll have the power to protect those you love, to reshape the world into something better. Refuse, and watch helplessly as everything you care about crumbles to dust. You're talking about corruption, Elara said, finding her voice at last. About becoming something monstrous. I'm talking about evolution, the queen corrected. About leaving behind the weaknesses of mortality and embracing something greater. Look around you, child. Do you see monsters here? Elara did look, studying the courtiers who lined the walls. They were beautiful, every one of them, possessed of an otherworldly grace that made her feel clumsy and crude by comparison. But there was something wrong with them as well, an emptiness behind their eyes, as if some essential part of what made them human had been carved away. I see people who have lost something essential, she said carefully. You see people who have been freed from the tyranny of conscience, the queen replied, from the crippling weight of moral uncertainty. They know their place in the grand design, understand their purpose, and find perfect contentment in service to something greater than themselves. They're slaves. We are all slaves to something, child. The only question is whether we choose our chains or have them forced upon us. The queen leaned forward, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. I am offering you the chance to choose your own bondage, to find purpose and power in service to something eternal and beautiful. Is that not preferable to dying meaninglessly in service to ideals that will be forgotten within a generation? The offer was tempting, more tempting than Elara wanted to admit. She could feel the pull of it, the seductive promise of power and purpose. Part of her wondered if the queen might be right, if her current path truly was leading nowhere but to an unmarked grave. But then she thought of Kaelan, of his steady strength and unwavering belief in their cause. She thought of the people she had met in her travels, ordinary men and women who had risked everything for the chance at a better world. She thought of the children who would grow up in whatever world emerged from the current conflict. No, she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. I won't trade my humanity for power, no matter how great the temptation. The queen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the throne room. The courtiers along the walls stirred restlessly, and Elara could feel their attention focusing on her with predatory intensity. How disappointing, the queen said with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Though I suppose I should have expected as much. The young are always so certain of their moral superiority, so convinced that their naive idealism can overcome any obstacle. She gestured, and Lucien stepped forward from the shadows where he had been waiting. Take her to the contemplation chamber. Perhaps a few days in isolation will help her see reason. Your Majesty, Lucien said, his voice carefully neutral. If I may suggest, you may not. The queen cut him off with a wave of her hand. I have made my decision. The girl will have time to consider her options without distraction. If she comes to her senses, well and good. If not, she shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying infinite indifference to Elara's fate. Lucien bowed deeply, though Elara thought she caught a flash of something disappointment, frustration, in his eyes before he could hide it. As you command, Your Majesty. The shadow bonds reformed around Elara's limbs, though this time they felt different, not quite as cold, not quite as constricting. Lucien led her from the throne room through a series of corridors that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. The walls shifted and changed as they walked, passages opening and closing according to some logic she couldn't fathom. The contemplation chamber, Lucien explained as they walked, is where the queen keeps prisoners she considers salvageable. It's designed to encourage introspection, self-examination, the gradual realization that one's previous beliefs may have been in error. You mean it's a torture chamber, Elara said flatly. Not in the conventional sense, he replied. There are no instruments of physical pain, no implements of bodily harm. The torment here is entirely psychological, though I'm told it can be quite effective. They stopped before a door that looked like all the others they had passed, plain wood banded with iron, unremarkable in every way. But when Lucien opened it, Elara could see that the chamber beyond was anything but ordinary. It was circular, with walls of polished black stone that reflected her image back at her from impossible angles. The ceiling was a dome of crystal that showed the starfield she had seen in the throne room, while the floor was covered in symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Welcome to your new home, Lucien said, guiding her inside. The shadow bonds released her as soon as she crossed the threshold, but she could feel that the room itself was a prison. The walls hummed with contained power, and she knew instinctively that any attempt to break through them would be futile. How long? She asked, turning to face her captor. That depends entirely on you, he replied. The queen is not cruel without purpose. Show her that you're willing to listen to reason, and you'll find her surprisingly generous. Continue in your stubborn refusal, and... He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. And what? She'll kill me? Death would be a mercy, Lucien said quietly. The queen has other methods at her disposal for dealing with the intractable. Methods that leave the body intact while altering other aspects of one's existence. He turned to leave, but Elara called out to stop him. Lucien, wait. He paused in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. Yes? Earlier, when you were talking about serving the queen, about protecting the light by standing guard in the darkness, did you mean that? Or was it just another manipulation? For a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. I stopped being able to tell the difference between truth and manipulation long ago, little dove. Perhaps that's the real curse of this place. Not the loss of humanity, but the gradual erosion of certainty about what humanity even means. He left her then, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the chamber like a death knell. Elara was alone with her thoughts and the slowly pulsing symbols on the floor. She explored the room, methodically, though there was little to find. No furniture save for a small cot in one corner, no windows, no obvious means of escape. The walls were smooth as glass and twice as hard, showing no sign of weakness or wear. The door had no handle on the inside, and she suspected it was warded against any form of forced entry. The symbols on the floor were another matter entirely. They seemed to respond to her presence, glowing brighter when she approached and dimming when she moved away. They were arranged in complex patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they contained geometric relationships that her mind was not equipped to process. She settled onto the cot, drawing her knees up to her chest and trying to organize her thoughts. The queen's offer had been real, she was certain of that much. The power she promised, the immortality, the ability to reshape the world according to her will. All of it was possible. The night court itself was proof that reality could be bent to serve the will of those strong enough to master it. But at what cost? She had seen the emptiness in the courtier's eyes, the hollow beauty that spoke of something essential carved away. She had heard the weariness in Lucien's voice when he spoke of no longer being able to distinguish truth from manipulation. Whatever power the queen offered, it came with a price that might be too high to pay. Time passed strangely in the contemplation chamber. The star field overhead wheeled through configurations that followed no pattern she could discern, and her body's natural rhythms seemed disrupted by the alien environment. She might have been there for hours or days, there was no way to tell. Sleep, when it came, was filled with dreams that felt more real than reality. She saw herself as the queen had offered to make her beautiful, powerful, eternal. She walked through worlds that bent to her will, commanded armies that existed only to serve her purpose, reshaped entire civilizations with a thought, but in every dream she was alone. The power was intoxicating, the control absolute, but she could never quite shake the feeling that something was missing. Some warmth, connection, some indefinable quality that made existence meaningful rather than merely eternal. She woke to find Lucien sitting in the corner of the chamber, watching her with those unsettling eyes. He had not been there when she fell asleep, and she wondered how long he had been observing her. "Interesting dreams?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "How did you?" She stopped, realizing the futility of the question. In a place where reality was negotiable, privacy was probably an illusion. The chamber reads the dreams of its occupants, he explained. It's part of the contemplation process. The Queen finds that people's unconscious desires often reveal more about their true nature than their conscious minds ever could. Then she knows I'm not going to change my mind. Does she? Lucian tilted his head, studying her with the intensity of a scholar examining a particularly complex theorem. Tell me, in your dreams, were you happy? The question caught her off guard. She had expected him to ask about the power, the immortality, the godlike abilities she had wielded in her sleep. Instead, he was interested in something far more fundamental. I don't know, she admitted. The power was intoxicating, but there was something missing. Some essential quality that made it all feel hollow. And what do you think that quality was? She was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over in her mind. Connection, she said finally. Love, the knowledge that what I did mattered to someone other than myself. Lucian nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had suspected. The Queen would tell you that such feelings are weaknesses, vulnerabilities that your enemies can exploit. She would say that true strength comes from needing no one, depending on nothing but your own will and power. And what would you say? I would say that a fortress with no doors is also a prison, he replied. That power without purpose is just elaborate masturbation, impressive to observe, but ultimately sterile. The crudeness of the comparison made her blink in surprise, and she realized it was the first time she had seen him drop his carefully maintained veneer of sophisticated menace. For just a moment, he had sounded debonair, almost human. Is that why you serve her? She asked. To give your power purpose? I serve her because the alternative is chaos, he said, his mask sliding back into place. Because someone needs to maintain the balance between order and entropy, even if the price is occasionally distasteful. But what if there were another way? What if the choice isn't between the Queen's order and complete chaos? Lucian's laugh was bitter as winter wind. What if the moon were made of cheese, and the stars were holes in heaven's floor? What if wishes were horses and beggars could ride? The world is what it is, little dove, not what we might wish it to be. You're wrong, Elara said, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. The world is what we make it. Every choice we make, every action we take, shapes reality just a little bit. Maybe I can't change everything. Maybe I can't defeat the Queen or save everyone I care about, but I can choose to be something other than what she wants me to become. And if that choice leads to your destruction, then at least it will be my choice to make. Lucian stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. The Queen has decided to accelerate your contemplation process. Tomorrow, you will be given a demonstration of what your refusal means for those you claim to care about. What kind of demonstration? Your friend Kaelin has been making inquiries about your disappearance. Tomorrow, he will find you, or rather, he will find what appears to be you. The Queen has crafted a perfect duplicate, identical in every way, save for the small detail of being completely under her control. Elara's blood turned to ice in her veins. No? She can't. She can and will, Lucian interrupted. Unless, of course, you choose to accept her offer before then. In which case, the duplicate will simply cease to exist, and you can return to your friend as yourself. The threat was elegantly simple and utterly devastating. Elara could imagine Kalen's relief at finding her, his joy at their reunion, completely unaware that the woman he held was nothing more than a puppet wearing her face. The duplicate would have access to all her memories, all her mannerisms, all the small intimacies that made their relationship unique. It would be the perfect infiltrator, positioned to destroy everything they had built from within. "You're monsters," she whispered, though the words felt inadequate to encompass the horror of what was being planned. "We are practical," Lucian corrected. "The Queen could simply kill your friend and be done with it, but she prefers more elegant solutions. This way he lives, your cause continues to function, and only you suffer the knowledge of what has been lost. It's almost merciful, really. There has to be another way." "There is," he said simply. "Accept the Queen's offer. Join us willingly, and your duplicate becomes unnecessary. You can return to your friend yourself, though admittedly changed by the experience. Changed into something that would betray everything he stands for. Changed into something with the power to actually accomplish what he's trying to do," Lucian countered. "Do you really think your little rebellion has a chance against the forces arrayed against it? Do you think passion and good intentions are enough to overcome centuries of entrenched power?" "I think they're a start," Elara said, stubbornly. "I think they're better than cynicism and surrender." Lucian sighed, a sound that somehow conveyed both frustration and something that might have been admiration. "You are either the bravest person I have ever met, or the most foolish, possibly both." He rose from his chair, moving toward the door with that fluid grace that marked him as something other than entirely human. At the threshold he paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I hope you find a way to prove me wrong." Then he was gone, leaving Elara alone with her thoughts and the terrible weight of the choice she had been given. She could sacrifice herself to save Kalen from deception, or she could sacrifice her principles to save him from betrayal. Either way, something precious would be lost. She spent the next several hours pacing the confines of her prison, her mind racing as she tried to find some third option, some clever solution that would allow her to outwit the Queen and save everyone she cared about. But the mathematics of the situation were relentless. The Queen held all the advantages: power, knowledge, time, while Elara had nothing but her own stubborn refusal to surrender. The symbols on the floor seemed to pulse in rhythm with her growing agitation, their light growing brighter as her desperation mounted. She found herself studying them more closely, trying to understand their purpose and meaning. They were clearly more than mere decoration. The way they responded to her presence suggested some kind of interactive function. On impulse, she knelt beside one of the larger symbols and placed her hand directly on its surface. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Light blazed up from the symbol, engulfing her hand in radiance that should have been painful but instead felt oddly soothing. Images flashed through her mind, fragments of memory and possibility, glimpses of past and future that came too fast to fully process. She saw herself as a child, lost and afraid in the aftermath of her parents' deaths. She saw the moment she first met Kalen, the way his smile had made her feel like she might actually have a future worth living. She saw the gradual awakening of her power, the slow realization that she was capable of things that defied rational explanation. But she also saw other possibilities, paths not taken, choices unmade. She saw herself accepting the Queen's offer, felt the intoxicating rush of power that came with abandoning her humanity. She saw herself ruling over kingdoms of the willing dead, beautiful and terrible and utterly alone. And then, just before the vision faded, she saw something else entirely. a figure standing in shadows, watching her with eyes that held depths of sorrow and regret. It was Lucien, but not as she knew him, younger, more human, with something like hope still flickering in his expression. The light faded, leaving her gasping on the floor of the chamber. Her hand was unmarked by the experience, but she could still feel the echo of what she had seen burning in her mind. The symbols around her had dimmed to their previous level, as if the energy she had absorbed had somehow satisfied their hunger. "Interesting," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Elara looked up to see the queen herself standing there, no longer wearing the elaborate gown from the throne room but dressed instead in simple robes of midnight blue. Without the formal trappings of her office, she looked almost human, a woman of perhaps 30 years with tired eyes and lines of strain around her mouth. "Your Majesty," Elara said, struggling to her feet. She wasn't sure if she should bow or kneel or simply stand her ground, so she settled for a careful nod of acknowledgement. "The symbols have not responded to a prisoner's touch in over 3 centuries," the queen observed, stepping into the chamber with the same fluid grace that marked all her movements. "The last person to activate them was Lucien, actually, when he first arrived here as my guest." "He was a prisoner too?" "Oh, yes," the queen said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Did he not tell you? How like him to omit the most relevant details. He came to me much as you did, dragged here against his will, full of righteous indignation and moral certainty. He spent nearly a year in this very chamber before he finally accepted the wisdom of my offer." The revelation hit Elara like a physical blow. She thought of Lucien's earlier words about choosing one's own chains, about standing guard in the darkness. Had it all been rationalization? Had he simply been broken down by time and isolation until surrender seemed like choice? "I see the understanding in your eyes," the queen continued. "Yes, my dear Lucien was once very much like you, young, idealistic, convinced that he could change the world through the sheer force of his convictions. It took some time to help him see the futility of such thinking. You broke him," Elara said, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. "I freed him," the queen corrected, "from the burden of impossible expectations, from the crushing weight of responsibility for things beyond his control. He is happier now, I assure you, than he ever was when he labored under the delusion that his individual choices mattered in the grand scheme of things." "Then why does he look so empty? Why does he sound so tired?" The queen's expression flickered for just a moment, a crack in her perfect composure that revealed something raw underneath. "Transformation is never without its costs," she admitted. "The process of becoming something greater than human necessarily involves leaving certain limitations behind." "You mean leaving humanity behind?" "I mean leaving weakness behind. Doubt, fear, the crippling uncertainty that comes from trying to navigate moral complexities without the wisdom to understand their true nature." The queen moved closer, her voice taking burr. "On a hypnotic quality. Tell me, child, have you never wished you could simply know the right course of action? Have you never longed for the certainty that comes from perfect understanding?" The temptation was there, Elara couldn't deny it. How many sleepless nights had she spent agonizing over decisions, wondering if she was making the right choice, terrified that her mistakes might cost innocent lives. How much easier would it be to simply know, with absolute certainty, what needed to be done? "That's not wisdom," she said finally. "That's just another kind of prison." "Is it?" The queen gestured, and the air shimmered around them. Suddenly they were standing in what appeared to be a war room, its walls covered with maps and charts that showed the movements of armies across multiple continents. "This is the current state of your little rebellion. Kaelin's forces, marked in blue, his enemies, marked in red. What do you see? Elara studied the maps, her heart sinking as she absorbed the information they contained. The blue markers were scattered and outnumbered. Isolated pockets of resistance surrounded by vast seas of red. Supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and several key strongholds appeared to be under siege. "They're losing," she whispered. "They lost before they began," the Queen said matter-of-factly. "Oh, they've managed some impressive victories here and there, disrupted a few supply convoys, liberated a handful of villages, but the mathematics are inexorable. They lack the resources, the training, and the strategic depth necessary to challenge an established power structure." "Then why haven't they been crushed already?" "Because their enemies are not particularly competent," the Queen replied with a dismissive wave. "The current rulers are corrupt, complacent, more interested in personal enrichment than effective governance. They could end your rebellion tomorrow if they chose to focus their full attention on it, but they're too busy squabbling among themselves to mount a coordinated response." She gestured again, and the maps changed to show different configurations, possible futures, Elara realized, branching probabilities that stemmed from the present moment. "Here," the Queen said, pointing to one particular timeline, "is what happens if you continue on your current path. Kalen's forces are gradually worn down by attrition. Key leaders are captured or killed. Within 2 years, the rebellion collapses entirely, and its survivors are either executed or absorbed into the existing power structure. And here," she pointed to another branch, "is what happens if you accept my offer. You return to Kalen with powers he cannot imagine, abilities that could turn the tide of any battle. You help him achieve victory after victory, building a momentum that even his enemies cannot stop. Within 5 years, he rules an empire, and you stand at his side as his closest advisor and most trusted friend." The vision was seductive. Elara could see herself as the Queen described, powerful enough to protect those she loved, wise enough to guide them toward lasting victory, but she had learned to look beyond the surface of such offers. "What's the catch?" she asked. "No catch," the Queen said with apparent sincerity. "Simply the understanding that power comes with responsibility. You would need to make difficult choices, sometimes sacrifice the few for the sake of the many. You would need to be strong enough to bear the weight of leadership without flinching from its harsher requirements." "You mean I would need to become like you?" "You would need to become someone capable of doing what must be done, regardless of how distasteful it might be." The Queen's voice was patient, almost maternal. "Do you think I enjoy the things I sometimes must do? Do you imagine I take pleasure in the suffering of others? Don't you?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment the Queen's mask slipped entirely. Elara saw something in her expression that she had not expected: genuine pain, carefully hidden but unmistakably real. "I take no pleasure in necessary cruelties," the Queen said quietly, "but I have learned to bear their weight without being crushed by it. That is what wisdom means. Child, the ability to act on knowledge rather than emotion, to choose the greater good even when it requires personal sacrifice." "And what about the duplicate you've created? What about the plan to deceive Kalen? Is that for the greater good too?" The Queen's expression hardened slightly. "That is a demonstration of the consequences of refusal. If you choose to cling to your naive idealism, then yes, I will use whatever tools are necessary to achieve my objectives. Your friend will be deceived. Your cause will be corrupted from within. And everything you claim to care about will be destroyed." "Why?" Elara asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "If you're really trying to help, if you genuinely believe your way is better, then why resort to such methods?" "Because sometimes the only way to save someone from their own stupidity is to show them its consequences," the Queen replied coldly. "You think your choices exist in a vacuum, that your personal integrity is more important than the lives of those who depend on you. I am offering you a lesson in reality, a demonstration of what your stubborn refusal actually costs." The war room faded around them, replaced once again by the familiar confines of the contemplation chamber. The Queen moved toward the door, her regal composure fully restored. "You have until tomorrow evening to make your decision," she said without looking back. "After that, events will proceed according to their natural course, and the responsibility for the consequences will rest entirely on your brawn shoulders." She paused at the threshold, glancing back with an expression that might have been pity. "I genuinely hope you make the right choice, child. The world has little enough wisdom as it is. It would be a shame to lose another potential source of it to misguided martyrdom." Then she was gone, leaving Elara alone with the weight of impossible choices. She sank onto the cot, burying her face in her hands as she tried to process everything she had learned. The Queen's offer was real, as was the power she promised. But the cost not just to herself, but to the very idea of choice and moral agency seemed too high to contemplate. Yet what was the alternative? If she refused, Kaelin would be deceived by her duplicate, their cause would be corrupted from within, and everyone she cared about would suffer for her decision. Could personal integrity really be worth such a price? She thought of Lucien, of the emptiness she had seen in his eyes. He had been like her once young, idealistic, convinced that individual choices mattered. Now he was something else entirely. A creature of power and pragmatism who could no longer distinguish between truth and manipulation. Was that really wisdom, or was it just another form of death? The symbols on the floor pulsed gently in the darkness, responding to her emotional turmoil. She found herself wondering what would happen if she activated them again, if she allowed herself to be drawn deeper into whatever visions they contained. Perhaps there were answers hidden in their alien geometry, solutions that her merely human perspective could not perceive. But before she could act on Kral, the impulse, she heard something that made her freeze, the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, moving with a stealth that suggested they did not belong to her usual captors. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to make out any other sounds that might give her a clue about who was approaching. The footsteps stopped directly outside her chamber, followed by a soft scratching sound that might have been someone working at the lock. Elara backed away from the door, her heart hammering as she tried to decide whether this represented rescue or some new form of torment. The door opened with the same soft click she had heard when Lucien departed, but the figure that stepped through was not the Queen's assassin. Instead, she found herself looking at someone she had never seen before, a young man, perhaps a few years older than herself, with dark hair and sharp features that bore more than a passing resemblance to Lucien. "Well?" he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "You're certainly prettier than the last prisoner they kept in here. Though, admittedly, that's not saying much. The previous occupant was a 300-year-old necromancer with a serious hygiene problem." "Who are you?" Elara asked, keeping her distance as she studied this unexpected visitor. "Name's Adrian," he replied with a grin that was all teeth and mischief. "Lucien's younger brother, professional troublemaker, and your best hope of getting out of this place with your soul intact." The revelation that Lucien had a brother was surprising enough, but the casual way Adrian spoke of rescue was even more so. "You're here to help me escape?" "I'm here to offer you a choice that doesn't involve surrendering your humanity or watching your friends get manipulated by magical puppets," he said, stepping into the chamber and closing the door behind him. "Though I should warn you up front, my plan has a fairly high probability of getting us both killed in spectacularly unpleasant ways." "What kind of plan?" Adrian's grin widened. "The kind that involves breaking into the Queen's private chambers, stealing one of the most closely guarded artifacts in all the realms, and using it to collapse the magical foundations that keep this entire palace from falling into the void." Interested? Despite everything, the impossible situation, the weight of her choices, the very real possibility that this was just another form of psychological manipulation, Elara found herself smiling for the first comer. "Time since her capture. Tell me more," she said. "Right then," Adrian said, producing what looked like a rolled-up piece of parchment from somewhere in his dark clothing. "First thing you need to understand is that the Night Court exists in a state of controlled magical instability. The Queen's power is what keeps it anchored to reality, prevents it from sliding off into the spaces between worlds where even nightmares fear to tread." He unrolled the parchment, revealing a detailed schematic of the palace that showed not just the physical structure, but also the flows of magical energy that ran through it like a circulatory system. "These are the ley lines that channel power from the Queen's throne room to every corner of the realm. Cut the right connections, and the whole thing comes apart like a house of cards in a hurricane." "And how do we cut those connections?" "With this," Adrian said, producing a small crystal that seemed to contain its own miniature storm. Lightning flickered within its depths, and Elara could feel the raw power radiating from it even at a distance. "The Heart of Tempests, one of 7 artifacts the Queen uses to maintain her control over the fundamental forces of reality. With it, we can disrupt the ley lines long enough to destabilize the entire palace." "Where did you get that?" Elara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Let's just say my dear brother isn't the only one with access to the Queen's private collection," Adrian replied with a wink. "Though I should mention that stealing it was the easy part. Actually using it without killing ourselves in the process that's going to be considerably more challenging." He began pointing to different areas on the schematic, his manner becoming more serious as he outlined the risks they would face. "The heart has to be activated at specific points along the ley line network here, here, and here. Each activation will send massive feedback through the system, and the Queen will know immediately what we're trying to do. So, we'll have to move fast. Faster than fast. We'll have maybe 30 seconds between activations before she can mobilize her guards, and maybe 5 minutes total before she realizes what we're really after and comes to stop us personally." Adrian's expression grew grim. "And trust me, you do not want to face the Queen on her home ground when she's truly angry." "What happens if we succeed?" "The palace destabilizes and begins falling back into the void between worlds. We'll have perhaps 10 minutes to escape before the whole thing disappears into whatever passes for oblivion in magical architecture." He paused, studying her face. "I should mention that escape in this context means using an untested experimental transportation spell that has roughly even odds of either getting us home safely or scattering our atoms across 17 different dimensions. And if we fail, then the Queen captures us, probably tortures us for information about how we managed to get this far, and then does things to our souls that would make death seem like a pleasant vacation." Adrian shrugged. "But hey, at least we'd go down fighting instead of surrendering without a struggle." Elara studied the schematic, trying to memorize the layout and the positions they would need to reach. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity, but it offered something the Queen's bargain did not: the chance to act according to her own principles rather than accepting someone else's definition of wisdom. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Why risk everything to help someone you barely know?" Adrian's expression grew thoughtful. "Because I remember what my brother was like before he came here. He was different, still dangerous, still capable of terrible things when necessary, but there was something in him that made those things matter, a core of something genuine that gave weight to his choices. And now? Now he's efficient, pragmatic. He does exactly what needs to be done, with perfect precision and no wasted motion. He's probably the most effective agent the Queen has ever had." Adrian's voice grew quiet. "But sometimes I catch him staring at nothing, and I can see the ghost of who he used to be looking out through his eyes. It's like watching someone drown in slow motion." "Do you think he could be saved?" "I think he's too far gone to save himself," Adrian replied honestly. "But maybe, if someone showed him that there was still a way to fight, still a chance to choose something other than surrender, maybe he could remember what it felt like to be human." The plan was madness. The odds of success were minimal, and the consequences of failure were too terrible to contemplate. But as Elara looked at the young man who was willing to risk everything for the slim chance of redemption, she felt something she had not experienced since her capture hope. "When do we start?" she asked. Adrian's grin returned in full force. "How about right now? The Queen thinks you're safely locked away in contemplation, and the guard rotation doesn't change for another hour. If we're going to do this, there's no better time than the present." He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the wood to listen for sounds in the corridor beyond. After a moment, he nodded and produced what looked like a small silver key from his pocket. "Master key," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "One of the perks of being raised in this madhouse, you learn all sorts of useful skills. Lock-picking, trap detection, how to move through shadow without triggering the palace's security enchantments." "You grew up here?" "Born and raised," he confirmed, opening the door with practiced ease. "The Queen collected our parents when Lucian and I were children, made them an offer they couldn't refuse, then extended the same courtesy to their offspring. Lucian embraced the opportunity. I maintained a more skeptical perspective." They slipped into the corridor, Adrian leading the way with the confident stride of someone who knew every secret passage and hidden shortcut in the entire structure. The halls were dimmer than they had been during Elara's psalm. Initial journey, lit only by crystals that pulsed with a soft blue-white radiance. "The first activation point is in the palace archives," Adrian whispered as they walked. "It's where the Queen keeps records of every bargain she's ever made, every soul she's claimed, every life she's altered. The ley line there is particularly strong because it's tied to the concept of memory itself." They descended a spiral staircase that seemed to go down much farther than the palace's apparent height would suggest. The walls here were carved with symbols similar to those in the contemplation chamber, but these were older, more complex, arranged in patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of one's eye. "Whatever you do," Adrian warned, "don't stare directly at the carvings. They're designed to trap the attention of anyone who looks too closely, and we don't have time to fish your consciousness out of a temporal loop." The archives, when they finally reached them, were unlike any library Elara had ever seen. The shelves stretched up into darkness, filled not with books, but with crystalline formations that pulsed with their own inner light. Each crystal, Adrian explained, contained the compressed essence of a single bargain, the complete record of what had been offered, what had been accepted, and what had been lost in the transaction. The Queen's entire power base, he said, gesturing at the impossible collection. Every deal she's ever made, every soul she's claimed, every piece of humanity she's carved away and stored for future use. If we wanted to really hurt her, we could shatter these crystals and release everything she's collected over the millennia. Why don't we? Because most of those souls have been trapped for centuries or longer. Releasing them all at once would create a psychic explosion that would probably level half the continent. Adrian moved toward a specific section of the archives, following some navigation system that was invisible to Elara. Besides, we're trying to escape, not commit genocide. He stopped before a crystal formation that was larger than the others, its surface swirling with colors that had no names in any human language. Here, he said, pulling out the heart of tempests. This is the central node for the memory ley line. When I activate the heart, it's going to send feedback through the entire network. The Queen will know immediately that something's wrong. How much time will we have? Maybe 2 minutes to reach the second activation point. Maybe less, if she's particularly paranoid today. Adrian held the crystal artifact carefully, its internal store responding to his touch by intensifying. Ready? Elara nodded, though she felt anything but ready. The moment he activated that device, they would be committed to a course of action that could only end in escape or destruction. There would be no turning back, no opportunity to reconsider or negotiate. Adrian pressed the heart of tempests against the large crystal formation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Light blazed from the contact point, racing outward through connections that suddenly became visible as lines of pure energy. The entire archive began to vibrate, a sound like distant thunder rolling through the crystalline structures. Go! Adrian shouted over the rising noise. Second point is in the Queen's private laboratory, 3 levels up. They ran through corridors that were now alive with alarm. Crystals flashed in warning patterns, and Elara could hear the sound of running feet as guards responded to the disturbance. Adrian led her through a maze of passages that seemed to twist back on themselves, defying the normal rules of architecture. Emergency protocols, he explained as they climbed another impossible staircase. The palace is trying to trap us by rearranging its internal structure. We have to reach the laboratory before it can completely reconfigure itself. The laboratory door stood open when they reached it, and Elara could see why the room beyond was a chaos of bubbling chemicals and arcane machinery, all of it responding to the disruption in the ley line network. Glass containers shattered as their contents boiled over, and mechanical devices sparked and wheezed as their power sources fluctuated wildly. There! Adrian pointed to a device that looked like a metallic tree, its branches covered with small gemstones that pulsed in rhythm with some unheard heartbeat. The nexus for the transformation ley line. This is where the Queen channels the power she uses to change people into whatever she wants them to become. He activated the heart of tempests again, and this time the feedback was even more violent. The metallic tree began to shake, its gemstone fruits flaring with brilliant light before beginning to crack and shatter. The sound was like breaking crystal mixed with screaming wind. "One more!" Adrian called, but his voice was nearly drowned out by the rising chaos. "The throne room. We have to disrupt the central nexus before." His words were cut off as the laboratory door slammed shut behind them. The Queen stood there, no longer dressed in her casual robes but wearing armor that seemed to be made from crystallized night itself. Her eyes blazed with fury, and the air around her rippled with barely contained power. "Foolish children," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. "Did you really think you could damage my realm and escape the consequences?" "Actually," Adrian replied with forced cheerfulness, "we were kind of hoping to finish the job before you showed up. Timing was never my strong suit." The queen raised her hand, and Elara felt the air around them begin to thicken, becoming as viscous as honey. Moving became increasingly difficult, and breathing required conscious effort. Adrian struggled to lift the heart of tempests, but his movements were slowing with each passing second. "You cannot destroy what has taken millennia to build," the queen continued, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Elara's bones. "You cannot unmake choices that have already been made, undo bargains that have already been sealed. All you can do is add your own failures to the collection." But even as she spoke, Elara could see cracks spreading through the laboratory walls. The disruption they had caused was still working its way through the palace's magical infrastructure, and the queen's attention was divided between maintaining her spell and keeping her realm from collapsing. That moment of distraction was all Adrian needed. With a supreme effort, he managed to raise the heart of tempests above his head. "Elara!" he shouted. "The transportation spell! It's carved into the floor near your feet." She looked down and saw symbols etched into the stone, similar to those in the contemplation chamber, but arranged in a different pattern. Without fully understanding what she was doing, she pressed her hand to the central symbol and felt it respond to her touch with a surge of power. "No!" the queen screamed, abandoning her spell of binding to leap toward them, but she was too late. The transportation circle blazed to life, engulfing them in light that was every color and no color at once. The last thing Elara saw before the world dissolved around her was the queen's face, beautiful and terrible in its fury, and the promise of vengeance that burned in those ancient eyes. Then everything went white, and she felt herself falling through spaces that had no names, toward a destination she could only hope would be home. When consciousness returned, she found herself lying on grass that smelled of earth and rain and growing things. Above her, a sky full of stars wheeled in patterns she recognized, constellations that belonged to the world she had been born in, rather than the alien geometries of the night court. "Adrian?" she called, struggling to sit up. Her body felt strange, as if it belonged to someone else, and her head pounded with the after-effects of magical transportation. "Here," came a weak voice from somewhere to her left. She turned to see Adrian lying nearby, his clothing singed and his face pale with exhaustion. "Well, that could have gone worse. We're alive. We're apparently back in the mortal realm, and I still have all my limbs. I count that as a victory." "Did we succeed?" she asked. "Did we actually damage the Queen's power?" "We disrupted 2 of the 7 ley lines that anchor her realm to reality," Adrian replied, sitting up with obvious effort. "It won't destroy her, but it will weaken her considerably. More importantly, it will force her to focus on repairs rather than expansion. Your friend should have some breathing room while she deals with the damage." Elara looked around, trying to get her bearings. They appeared to be in a meadow somewhere, though she couldn't see any familiar landmarks. The grass was long and wild, suggesting they were far from any settled area. "Where are we?" "About 50 miles south of where your friend Kaelin was last reported to be," Adrian said, consulting what looked like a small compass made of crystallized starlight. "The transportation spell was designed to bring us as close to your desired destination as possible, while avoiding areas of high magical activity." "Kaelin," Elara breathed, hope and anxiety warring in her chest. Do you know if the Queen's duplicate? The duplicate would have been tied to the transformation ley line, Adrian assured her. When we disrupted that nexus, any ongoing transformations or replications would have collapsed. Your friend should be safe from that particular threat. Relief flooded through her, so intense it was almost physically painful. Whatever else happened, at least Kaelin would not be deceived by a magical puppet wearing her face. That was something, even if it wasn't everything. What about Lucien? She asked. What happens to him now? Adrian's expression grew somber. I don't know. The Queen will be furious, and she'll need someone to blame for what happened. Lucien is her most trusted agent, which means she'll expect him to take responsibility for not preventing our escape. Will she hurt him? She'll do whatever she thinks is necessary to maintain discipline, Adrian replied carefully. But Lucien is too valuable to destroy outright. More likely, she'll find ways to make him suffer that don't reduce his effectiveness as her weapon. The thought of Lucien facing the Queen's wrath because of their actions was almost unbearable, but Elara forced herself to focus on what could be changed rather than what was already done. They had struck a blow against the Night Court's power, created an opportunity for the resistance to regroup and strengthen itself. That had to count for something. What will you do now? She asked Adrian. Keep running, most likely, he said with a rueful smile. The Queen will send hunters after me, and I'd rather not lead them to your friends. I'll head east, try to lose myself in the wild lands beyond the Thornwall Mountains. Maybe find some other troublemakers who need a hand with their impossible schemes. You could come with us, Elara offered. Kaelin would welcome another ally, especially one with your skills. Tempting, Adrian admitted. But I'm not really the type for organized rebellion. I work better as a free agent, causing trouble wherever it's most needed. He stood, brushing grass from his clothes. Besides, you don't need me anymore. You've proven that the Queen can be opposed, that her power isn't absolute. That knowledge will be worth more than any single ally. He was right, Elara realized. What they had accomplished in the Night Court went beyond the immediate tactical advantages. They had demonstrated that the seemingly omnipotent could be challenged, that even the most ancient powers had vulnerabilities. That lesson would spread, inspiring others to resist instead of surrendering. Thank you, she said, meaning it more deeply than words could convey. For everything. For the rescue, for the risk, for showing me that there was another choice. Thank you for reminding me why the choice matters, Adrian replied. He pulled out a small object that looked like a carved bone whistle. This will summon help if you ever find yourself in truly desperate circumstances. It's keyed to my magical signature, so I'll know if you use it. Don't waste it on anything less than world-ending catastrophe. He handed her the whistle, their fingers brushing for a moment. His skin was warm, human in a way that Lucien's had not been, and she found herself wondering what other paths might have been possible if circumstances had been different. Will I see you again? She asked. Probably, Adrian said with that mischievous grin she was beginning to associate with him. I have a talent for showing up where I'm least expected and most needed. But for now, you need to focus on getting back to your friends and preparing them for what's coming. What do you mean? The Queen won't forget this insult, Adrian said, his expression growing serious. She'll be weakened for a time, focused on repairing the damage we caused, but she won't abandon her interest in you. If anything, what we did tonight will only make her more determined to possess you. Then this was all for nothing. No, Adrian said firmly. This bought you time, and time is the most valuable commodity in any war. Use it wisely." He stepped back, raising his hand in a gesture that was part farewell and part blessing. "Until we meet again, Elara Thorne. Try not to get yourself killed before then. I have a reputation to maintain." Light began to gather around him, the same type of transportation magic he had used to help them escape the Night Court. But this spell was different, more controlled, designed for a single traveler rather than a desperate escape. "Wait," Elara called out, but it was too late. The light flared, and when it faded, Adrian was gone. She was alone in the meadow with nothing but the stars for company and a long journey ahead of her. She began walking north, guided by the constellation patterns she had learned as a child. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying scents of wildflowers and distant rain. After the alien atmosphere of the Night Court, these simple, familiar sensations felt like a homecoming. As she walked, her mind turned over everything that had happened, processing the experiences and revelations of her captivity. The Queen's offer had been real, she was certain of that. The power, the immortality, the ability to reshape reality according to her will. All of it could have been hers, for the simple price of surrendering her humanity. But what was humanity, really? Was it the capacity for doubt, for moral uncertainty, for the kind of crippling empathy that made difficult decisions almost unbearable? Or was it something deeper, the spark of consciousness that insisted on choosing its own path, even when that path led to suffering? She thought of Lucien, trapped in his beautiful prison of perfect efficiency. He had gained everything the Queen promised: power, purpose, freedom from the burden of moral uncertainty. But in gaining those things, he had lost something essential, some quality that had made his choices meaningful rather than merely effective. The Queen had been wrong about one thing, Elara realized. Wisdom wasn't the ability to act without doubt or uncertainty. True wisdom was the courage to act despite those things, to make choices based on principles rather than expedience, to accept the responsibility that came with free will. The walk back to civilization took most of the night. She followed game trails through dark forests, crossed streams that reflected starlight like scattered diamonds, climbed hills that offered glimpses of distant lights that might have been towns or campfires. Her body grew tired, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in days. Dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains when she finally saw something that made her heart leap with recognition: the smoke of cook fires rising from a camp she knew well. Kaelin's forces had established a temporary base in a valley that was defensible but not obviously military, a place where they could rest and regroup without drawing unwanted attention. She approached the perimeter carefully, aware that sentries would be watching for threats in the gray light of early morning. But she was still surprised when a familiar voice called out from the shadows of a nearby boulder. "Elara, is that really you?" She turned to see Marcus emerging from concealment, his crossbow lowered, but not quite set aside. The young scout looked older than when she had last seen him, marked by the strain of constant vigilance and the weight of responsibilities that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. "It's me," she confirmed, feeling a smile spread across her face at the sight of a friendly face. "Though I wouldn't blame you for being skeptical. A lot has happened since I disappeared." Marcus studied her carefully, his expression mixing relief with wariness. "Kaelin has been out of his mind with worry. We've been searching for you for 3 days, following every lead, checking every rumor. Where have you been?" "It's complicated," Elara replied. "Is he here? Kaelin, I mean. I need to see him, need to explain what happened." "He's in the command tent. Probably hasn't slept since you vanished." Marcus gestured toward the heart of the camp. "But, Elara," Be prepared. He's not the same man he was when you left. The stress of losing you, the pressure of keeping the rebellion together. It's taken a toll. As they walked through the camp, Elara could see what Marcus meant. The faces she passed were drawn with exhaustion and anxiety, marked by the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from fighting a war with inadequate resources against overwhelming odds. The rebellion that had seemed so full of hope and possibility just days ago now looked fragile, held together by little more than stubbornness and desperation. The command tent was larger than the others, but still Spartanly furnished a few camp chairs around a table covered with maps and reports, oil lamps providing pools of yellow light in the gray dawn. Kalen stood with his back to the entrance, hunched over the table as he studied what appeared to be troop movement reports. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, "someone here to see you." Kalen didn't look up immediately, his attention focused on the papers before him. "If it's about the supply convoy from Millhaven, tell them we'll have to make do with half rations for another week. If it's about the reports of night corn activity near the Thorn Wall, tell them we're already aware and—" "Kalen," Elara said softly. He froze, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles went white. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't speak, as if afraid that turning around would reveal her voice to be just another cruel trick of an exhausted mind. "Kalen," she said again, stepping closer. "It's me. I'm back." He turned slowly, and she saw that Marcus had been right about the toll her absence had taken. Kalen's face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, his usually perfect grooming abandoned in favor of function over form. But when he saw her, really saw her, standing there in the entrance to his tent, his expression transformed. Relief, joy, and something that might have been anger warred across his features before settling into an emotion too complex for any single name. He crossed the space between them in 2 quick strides, pulling her into an embrace that was fierce enough to drive the breath from her lungs. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered against her hair. "I thought they'd taken you, broken you, turned you into something else. I thought—" His voice cracked, and she could feel the tremor in his hands as he held her. "I'm here," she murmured, returning the embrace with equal intensity. "I'm alive, I'm myself, and I'm here." They stood like that for several minutes, neither willing to break the contact that proved she was real and safe, and returned to him. But eventually practical concerns reasserted themselves, and Kalen pulled back enough to study her face with the careful attention of someone looking for signs of damage. "Are you hurt? What did they do to you?" "It's a long story," Elara said, settling into one of the camp chairs as exhaustion finally caught up with her. "But the short version is that I was captured by agents of the Night Court, taken before their queen, and offered a bargain I couldn't accept." Kalen's expression darkened. "The Night Court. I should have known. What kind of bargain?" "Power," she said simply. "Immortality. The ability to reshape reality. All the strength we would need to win this war and reshape the world afterward. All for the small price of surrendering my humanity and becoming something like their queen herself." "And you refused." "I refused." She met his eyes, seeing the understanding there, the knowledge that she had chosen their cause, chosen him, over powers that could have made their struggles unnecessary. "Though I'll admit the temptation was real. The queen is persuasive." Kalen settled into the chair across from her, his expression growing thoughtful. "How did you escape?" "The Night Court's prisons are said to be inescapable." "I had help," Elara replied, thinking of Adrian's reckless courage and the price Lucian might even now be paying for their success. "Someone who reminded me that surrender and pragmatism aren't the same thing as wisdom." She told him the story then, leaving out nothing of importance but being careful not to dwell on details that might cause him unnecessary pain. She spoke of Lucien's complex nature, of the Queen's seductive offer, of Adrian's desperate plan and their narrow escape. Throughout it all, Kaelin listened with the focused attention of a military commander receiving a critical intelligence briefing. "So the Night Court is weakened but not destroyed," he said when she finished. "And they'll be focused on internal repairs rather than external expansion." "For now," Elara confirmed. "But Adrian warned me that the Queen won't forget this insult. If anything, what we did will make her more determined to possess me. Then we need to be ready for her next move." Kaelin rose, moving to the map table where he began studying the positions of their forces. "We'll need to strengthen our defenses, improve our intelligence networks, maybe consider more aggressive action while she's distracted." "Kaelin," Elara said quietly, recognizing the signs of his strategic prepared mind taking over. "There's something else we need to discuss." He looked up from the maps, his expression questioning. "The offer the Queen made, it wasn't just about me. It was about the fundamental question of what we're fighting for." She stood, moving to join him at the table. "She showed me visions of our future, of what happens if we continue on our current path. And, according to her calculations, we lose. Not just this battle or that campaign, but the entire war. Our forces are gradually worn down by attrition, our leaders captured or killed, our cause forgotten within a ball. Generation." Kaelin's jaw tightened. "The Queen of the Night Court is hardly an unbiased source of military intelligence." "No, but she's also had 5,000 years to observe the rise and fall of empires. Her perspective might be skewed, but her experience is undeniable." Elara touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "I'm not saying we should despair or surrender, but I think we need to be honest about the challenges we face." "What are you suggesting?" "That we can't win this war through conventional means. We're outmanned, outgunned, and outmaneuvered by enemies who have had centuries to perfect their systems of control." She gestured at the maps, at the scattered blue markers that represented their forces. "But we have something they don't. The ability to change, to adapt, to find new ways of thinking about old problems." "Go on." "The Queen's power comes from people accepting that her way is the only way, that the choice is between her order and complete chaos. But what if we prove that's a false choice? What if we show people that there's a third option, not the surrender of individual will, but the voluntary cooperation of free minds?" Kaelin was quiet for a long moment, studying the maps with new eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. "You're talking about changing the nature of the conflict itself. Instead of fighting them on their terms, we create new terms entirely." "Exactly. We stop trying to defeat them and start trying to make them irrelevant." Elara felt the excitement of the idea building in her chest. "We build something better, something that doesn't require the sacrifice of humanity for the sake of power." "It would be dangerous," Kaelin warned. "The kind of fundamental change you're describing. It would threaten every power structure, every established authority. We'd be making enemies of everyone who benefits from the current system." "We already have. Why?" Elara pointed out. "The difference is that now we'd be fighting for something positive instead of just against something negative." Outside the tent, she could hear the sounds of the camp waking up soldiers calling to each other, horses snorting and stamping, the clatter of cooking implements as breakfast was prepared. These were the sounds of people trying to build lives worth living despite the chaos around them. And suddenly, she felt more hopeful than she had since her capture. "There's something else," she said, remembering the whistle Adrian had given her. She pulled it from her pocket, showing Kaelin the carved bone artifact. I have a way to contact someone who might be able to help us. Someone with experience fighting the Night Court on their own terms. The person who helped you escape? Adrian. He's complicated. Not exactly an ally, but definitely an enemy of our enemies. He might be willing to share intelligence, provide advice, maybe even direct assistance if the situation becomes desperate enough. Kaelin studied the whistle with the careful attention he gave to all potentially useful tools. And you trust him? I trust his hatred of the Queen and his love for his brother, Elara replied. That's not the same thing as trusting him completely, but it might be enough for our purposes. His brother? Lucien, the Queen's assassin who questioned me. Elara felt a pang of guilt as she thought of the complex, damaged man who might even now be suffering for their escape. Adrian is trying to save him from what the Queen has made him, just like we're trying to save everyone else from what she wants to make them. Then we have something in common, Kaelin said, his expression growing thoughtful. The desire to preserve what makes us human, even in the face of forces that would take that away. They spent the next several hours planning, discussing strategies and possibilities with the kind of focused intensity that had always characterized their partnership. But this time was different. Instead of simply reacting to their enemies' moves, they were trying to envision something genuinely new. A way of organizing society that didn't require the surrender of individual freedom for the sake of collective security. It was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible, but Elara found herself energized by the challenge. The Queen had been wrong about one crucial thing. Idealism wasn't a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be harnessed. The vision of a better world was what gave their struggle meaning, what transformed it from mere rebellion into genuine revolution. As the morning wore on, other members of their inner circle began arriving at the command tent. Marcus returned with scouting reports, followed by Elena the healer with updates on wounded personnel, then Captain Rodriguez with intelligence about enemy troop movements. Each new arrival brought both problems to solve and resources to utilize, the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that held their movement together. We need to call a general assembly, Kaelin said finally, after reviewing all the reports and updates. Everyone needs to hear what Elara learned in the Night Court, and we need to start discussing what it means for our future strategy. Are you sure? Elara asked. Some of what I experienced. It might be difficult for people to hear. The Queen's power is real, and so are the threats she represents. All the more reason to be honest about what we're facing, Kaelin replied. Our people have the right to know what they're fighting against, and they have the right to choose whether they want to continue fighting it. The assembly was held in a natural amphitheater, formed by the valley's rocky walls, with speakers standing on a raised platform while their audience arranged itself on the surrounding slopes. As Elara looked out at the faces gathered there, soldiers and civilians, veterans and newcomers, people of every age and background united by their shared commitment to change, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She told her story again, this time in greater detail and to a larger audience. She spoke of the Night Court's alien beauty and terrible power, of the Queen's seductive offer and the price it would have demanded. She described Lucien's empty perfection and Adrian's desperate courage, the choices that had led to her escape, and the knowledge she had gained about their enemy's true nature. The Queen believes that freedom is chaos, she concluded, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. She thinks that the only alternative to her perfect order is complete anarchy, that people cannot be trusted to make good choices without someone else defining what good means. A murmur ran through the crowd. voices raised in discussion and debate. She could see the fear in some faces, the realization of just how powerful their enemy truly was. But she could also see determination, the stubborn refusal to surrender that had brought these people together in the first place. "So, what do we do?" called out a voice from the crowd. It was Thomas, a former merchant who had joined them after losing his business to corrupt officials. "How do we fight something like that?" "We prove her wrong," Elara replied. "We build something better, something that preserves individual freedom while still providing the benefits of organized society. We show the world that the choice isn't between tyranny and chaos, it's between surrender, hope." "Pretty words," said another voice, this one from Sarah, a veteran soldier whose unit had been decimated in an early battle. "But how do we turn words into reality? How do we fight gods with mortal weapons?" "By remembering that gods only have power when people believe in them," Kaelin said, stepping forward to join Elara on the cod platform. "The Queen's strength comes from the acceptance of her authority, from people's willingness to trade their freedom for her protection. Take away that acceptance, and her power becomes just another form of magic impressive, not invincible." "And how do we take away that acceptance?" Thomas asked. "By offering something better," Elara said. "By creating communities where people can be free without being alone, where individual choice and collective responsibility work together instead of against each other." The discussion that followed was heated but productive, with people asking hard questions and proposing practical solutions. Some wanted to focus on military action, striking at the Queen's forces while they were weakened by the damage to their magical infrastructure. Others advocated for political solutions, reaching out to potential allies among the existing power structures. But gradually, a consensus began to emerge around Elara's central idea that their goal should not be to defeat their enemies so much as to make them irrelevant, to create alternatives that people would choose freely, rather than having imposed upon them. "It won't be easy," Captain Rodriguez warned. "Every power structure has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. They'll fight us not because they believe in the Queen, but because they profit from the current system." "Then we'll have to make sure the alternative is more profitable," suggested Elena. "Not in terms of money necessarily, but in terms of everything people actually value: security, community, the chance to build something meaningful." "And we'll need to be prepared for setbacks," Marcus added. "The Queen won't just sit back and watch us build a better world. She'll try to corrupt our efforts, turn our own people against us, make us into the very thing we're fighting against. That's why we need to be constantly vigilant about our own motivations," Elara said. "The moment we start believing that the ends justify any means, the moment we decide that we know better than other people what's good for them, we become what we're fighting against." The assembly continued well into the afternoon, with working groups forming to address specific challenges: food production, defensive strategy, recruitment and training, intelligence gathering. It was the kind of organized chaos that Elara was beginning to recognize as democracy in action: messy and inefficient, but ultimately more resilient than any system based on unquestioned authority. As the formal discussions wound down and people began to disperse to their various duties, Kaelin approached her with an expression of mixed pride and concern. "You've given them hope," he said quietly. "But you've also raised expectations that might be impossible to meet." "Impossible expectations are better than no expectations at all," Elara replied. "At least they give us something to aim for. And if we fail, if it turns out the Queen was right, that people really can't handle freedom without destroying themselves, then we'll have failed while trying to do something worthwhile." she said. That's better than succeeding at something that doesn't matter. Kaelin smiled at that, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since her return. You know, I think your time in the Night Court might have been good for you. You sound more certain of yourself than before. I sound more certain of what I believe in, she corrected. There's a difference. As evening approached, they found themselves sitting together on a hilltop overlooking the camp, watching the sun set behind the western mountains. The sight was beautiful in its simplicity, no alien geometries or impossible colors, just the familiar rhythm of day giving way to night in a world that followed comprehensible rules. Do you think we can really do it? Kaelin asked quietly. Build something that preserves freedom without sacrificing order? I think we have to try, Elara replied, because the alternative, accepting that the Queen is right, that freedom really is just another word for chaos that's not living. That's just existing. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. These were the same stars Elara had seen from the Night Court's impossible palace. That here they looked different, warmer, more welcoming, part of the universe that might be vast and mysterious, but was not actively hostile. To human happiness. There's something I need to tell you, Kaelin said eventually. Something that happened while you were gone. His tone was serious enough to make her turn and look at him directly. What is it? We received an offer, not from the Night Court, but from the Summer Court. They want to meet with us, discuss the possibility of an alliance against our mutual enemies. Elara felt her heart skip a beat. The Summer Court was one of the great Fae powers, rivaling the Night Court in strength if not in subtlety. An alliance with them could change the entire balance of the conflict, but it would also mean accepting help from beings whose motivations were even more alien than the Queen's. What kind of alliance? She asked carefully. They didn't specify. The message was deliberately vague, probably to avoid giving us too much information before they're certain of our intentions. Kaelin handed her a piece of parchment that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. But they want to meet within the week, at a location of their choosing. Elara studied the message, written in script that seemed to change and flow even as she watched. The words were in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow she could understand their meaning: invitation to parley, an offer of mutual assistance, a warning that time was growing short. It could be a trap, she said finally. It could be, Kaelin agreed. But it could also be our best chance of gaining the allies we need to survive what's coming. What do you think we should do? I think, Kaelin said, taking the parchment back and rolling it carefully, that we should accept their invitation. But not just the two of us, we should bring a full delegation, people who can speak for all aspects of our movement. And we should go prepared for anything, including betrayal? Especially betrayal. His expression grew grim. The Fae are not human, and their concepts of honor and obligation are different from ours. But sometimes the enemy of your enemy is the closest thing to a friend you can find. As they made their way back down the hill toward the camp, Elara found herself thinking about choices and consequences, about the web of decisions that had brought them to this point, and the ones that lay ahead. The Queen had been wrong about many things, but she had been right about one: the world was painted in shades of gray, and anyone who claimed to see it in black and white was either lying or blind. But that didn't mean all choices were equal, or that moral uncertainty was an excuse for moral paralysis. Sometimes you had to act despite not knowing all the consequences, had to choose based on principles rather than certainty, had to trust that doing the right thing for the right reasons would somehow lead to the right outcome. The camp was quieter now, most people having settled in for the night. Cook fires cast dancing shadows on tent walls. and the low murmur of conversation drifted on the evening air. It was peaceful in a way that the night court's alien beauty had never been the peace that came from knowing you were among people who shared your values, even if they didn't always agree on methods. "Elara," Kalen said as they reached his tent. "Thank you." "For what?" "For coming back, for choosing us over power, for reminding me why we're doing this." He paused, his expression growing serious. "I know the Queen's offer was real. I know what you gave up by refusing it." "I didn't give up anything," she said firmly. "I chose something better." "And what was that?" She smiled, thinking of Adrian's reckless courage and Lucian's hidden pain, of the people gathered in the amphitheater that afternoon, and the choices that had brought them all together. "The chance to be human," she said, "in all its messy, uncertain, beautiful complexity." As she made her way to her own tent, Elara felt a sense of completion settling over her like a warm blanket. The Queen had tried to convince her that wisdom meant eliminating uncertainty, that strength came from needing no one and depending on nothing. But standing here in this camp full of people who had chosen hope over fear, community over isolation, she knew better. True wisdom wasn't the absence of doubt. It was the courage to act despite doubt, to choose love over power, to trust in the essential goodness of people even when they failed to live up to that potential. And true strength wasn't the ability to stand alone. It was the willingness to stand together, to support and be supported, to accept that vulnerability and connection were not weaknesses, but the very things that made life worth living. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to prove that the Queen's cynicism was not the final word on human nature. The Summer Court's invitation would need to be considered, their enemies' next moves anticipated, their own movements strengthened and refined. But tonight, for the first time since her capture, Elara slept peacefully. She had been offered the chance to become something greater than human, and had chosen instead to remain something more precious herself, flawed and uncertain and free. And in that choice, she had found something the Queen would never understand. The knowledge that some things were worth more than power, that some battles were worth fighting even if victory was not guaranteed, that some choices were right simply because they were chosen freely rather than imposed by force. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow comforting in their constancy. And in a tent, in a hidden valley, surrounded by friends and allies, and the promise of tomorrow's possibilities, Elara dreamed not of power or immortality, but of home, a place where freedom and community could coexist, where individuals could choose their own paths while still walking together toward something better than any of them could achieve alone. It was a dream worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. But more importantly, it was a dream worth living for, worth the daily struggle of building something real, from the raw materials of hope and determination, and the stubborn refusal to accept that the world could not be improved. And in her dreams, she heard the echo of Adrian's laughter and saw the ghost of humanity in Lucian's eyes, reminders that even in the darkest places, even among the most corrupted souls, the spark of choice still burned. It might be dimmed or hidden or nearly extinguished, but it could never be completely destroyed, as long as someone was willing to tend the flame. The Queen had been wrong about that too. People could be broken, yes, but they could also be healed. They could be corrupted, but they could also be redeemed. They could lose their way, but they could also find it again, sometimes in the most unlikely places and through the most unexpected acts of courage. As dawn broke over the mountains and the camp began to stir with the activities of a new day, Elara woke with the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as herself, human, flawed, free, and unafraid to choose hope over despair, love over power, and the uncertain promise of tomorrow over the false security of surrendering to forces beyond her control. The Night Court's shadows had not claimed her, and they never would. She had chosen thorns over wings, mortality over eternal emptiness, and in that choice had found something more valuable than all the Queen's promises, the knowledge that she was exactly who she was meant to be, exactly when the world needed her most. The story was far from over, but this chapter had ended well. And sometimes, in a world full of impossible choices and uncertain outcomes, that was enough.